Hello, Happy New Year. Welcome to Post Colonial Space. This is our first webinar of the year, so I hope slowly you all will join me. I hope you've had a wonderful beginning of the year. And today we will briefly talk about Salman Rushdie, especially Midnight's Children. Come. I am, as you know, Masood Raja, and I'm delighted to be here. And from me to all of you, Happy New Year. I hope this year turns out to be better than the last one. And we will continue this year until we decide otherwise to discuss various post-colonial themes. My plan is to maybe focus on a few good books. That's why I decided to do Midnight's Children. But there are some other suggestions as well, which people have sent my way, and I'll try to make sure that I, act on them. Meanwhile, there are a few other developments as well. We now have a full podcast, and it's called Post Colonial Space. It's available on all the major podcast platforms. And what I'm doing is I am slowly moving the audio content of a lot of the videos from the channel to the podcast. We also have a Facebook page, which is a Facebook group, which is called Post Colonial Space. You're free to join that as well. And so these are some of the two new developments. Okay, so let me welcome, Cat Scratch Coder. I don't know your real name, but welcome. And I'm pretty sure all of our other usual suspects will be here too soon. Infinita is here. Welcome. Happy New Year. And so I'll welcome you as you join in. So today's topic loosely is Salman Rushdie and Midnight's Children. Now, Midnight's Children is one of my most favorite novels for a lot of reasons. And I consider it Rushdie's best work. And of course, a lot of people other than me also consider it. The novel came out in 1981. It won then what was called the Booker Prize. Then it won later the Booker of Booker Prizes. It also won the 25-year anniversary prize for the Booker Prize. These are some of the accolades that it has received. But another important thing about the novel is that when it came out in England, English novel, the critics had kind of declared it dead. And there weren't many good English novels being produced. So Midnight's Children kind of reinvents the British novel. And invigorates the novelistic tradition in England and also in the world. Now, a lot of people don't realize that Midnight's Children wasn't Salman Rushdie's first novel. His first novel actually was called Grimace, which was a science fiction sort of a novel. The main protagonist is a Native American, but that novel didn't get much traction. And according to one of the critics, Timothy Brennan, the reason is that novel didn't have a habitus in place. It didn't belong to any particular place. Habitus, as it comes from Pierre Bourdieu, right? The concept of habitus. So Midnight's Children, of course, it's called a novel of India, and it's more than that, but a novel of India, a novel specifically that deals with freedom of India, its colonial heritage, but also the division of India between Pakistan and India, the creation of Pakistan. And it deals with those issues. The main character and the narrator is Salim Sinai. He is our main character. He is the narrator of the novel. And what makes his narration peculiar is that he is born at midnight when India wins its freedom and when India and Pakistan are created into two separate countries. So that's his birth. And then from then on, his life, if you even the first beginning lines of the novel will tell you, is intertwined with life of India. And every historical event that is mentioned is in one way or the other connected to his life. So in a way, then we can also read in Salim Sinai, um, he himself as being sort of an embodiment of India. Now, the reason the novel is called Midnight's Children is because 1,000 children, according to the novelistic universe, were born at midnight on August 15, 1947. All of these 1,000 children have magical powers. They are magical. And Salim Sinai is kind of the center of it because he's a telepath. He can read others' thoughts, not normal human beings, but he can be in contact with the other special children. So that's roughly the idea. And he's the one through whom all of them are connected. Okay. And then we follow his life. Part of the novel is life before he is born, even though he himself is narrating it. That's a really interesting narrative technique, of course, and it comes from Tristram Shandy, right? The 19th century novel. And Rushdie gives credit to it, that creation. There is another modern novel to which Midnight's Children is compared, and that is Günter Grass's The Tin Drum, because the main actor there also narrates his own story, starting from before his birth and then after his birth. And so these are some of the things. Now, we go through the whole narrative of India before its independence. Where is placed the life of Salim Sinai's parents? They are from Kashmir region. Then we go through partition and through India's independence, and we go all the way to Indira Gandhi and emergency. We go through 1965, India-Pakistan war, 1971 war, creation of Bangladesh, and then we are in 1980s. This is the time when Indira Gandhi had implemented the emergency, and that's where the novel ends, and we kind of feel like our narrator is disintegrating. He knows that he's not going to survive this. And maybe we're supposed to read that that's what is happening to India as well at that time. Quite a few characters in the novel, but the two prominent minor characters are, of course, Padma, and she is the woman with whom Salim Sinai is staying. She is a worker, but she's also the narratee. Most of the story is told to Padma, and a few times she intervenes within the narrative. And the other minor character that I find important is the character of Tai, who plies a boat on Lake Dal, and he is represented as ancient and part of the land itself. Slightly stereotypically, but these are the two characters. Now, a lot of people will tell you that the novel is extremely postmodern. Yeah, it does sound like X-Men. So now keep in mind that Rushdie is heavily influenced by popular culture. And we'll get to that. But Rushdie, of course, before he comes to writing serious fiction, what did he write? He wrote jingles, right, for an advertising company. So he has that access to popular culture that shows dominantly in all his works, but also in Midnight's Children. And then this is also, of course, considered a postmodern novel, right? So to understand that, we have to keep a basic understanding of postmodernism. So let's say one important part of it is intertextuality. What that means is that an author or a text may borrow stories from another author, even the names of the characters, and rewrite them. So this assumption that I am coming with my original ideas no longer holds in postmodernism, because you can play with other people's ideas, you can rework previously published works in your own work. So as I mentioned, Tristram Shandy is in here. Influence of that is pretty obvious. Then Gunther Grass's The Tin Drum, even the opening scene is pretty similar to that. Another aspect of postmodernism is historiographic meta-fiction, the idea that comes from Linda Hutchin. And I have a whole lecture on postmodernism that you can, use to understand it. But historiographic meta-fiction, part of it is that you take historical events, right, and set your story in there. Sometimes historical characters appear as characters in the novel, right? So Indira Gandhi is represented in the novel as this menacing figure who actually is out to destroy the Midnight's children. So that aspect of it makes it deeply postmodern, right? And then, of course, self-reflexivity. A lot of people will say, oh, the novel is self-reflexive. They don't really explain what it means. So simply what it means is that as you read the novel points to itself as being a novel, right? Or a story that tells you, I am being told, I am a story. So that part of it makes it postmodern as well. And then there is the part which I slightly contend with, I slightly disagree with, maybe because people call it magic realism as well. I think maybe there are parts of it which are magic realism, but one important aspect of Latin American magic realism is that it's not that there is magic in a story. That's not what makes a novel magic realistic novel. It's that magic is represented as everyday occurrence. If that's so, then it becomes a magical realist novel. Here, that distinction doesn't really hold, because most of the time when there are magical beings in the novel, they are represented as magical beings. Their abilities are not represented as everyday normal. Now, if you've read your Garcia Marquez, you already know that when he talks about, in 100 Years of Solitude, when people talk about, oh, so and so could fly, it's just taken as granted. It's just taken as a normal thing. And that's the distinction we must make in declaring something magic realism. So these are some of the things about the novel that I had kept in. Of course, I'm not going to go over the novel and, tell you about its plot and all that you already probably know if you've read it. If you haven't read it, of course, I highly recommend that you read it. But the things that are covered are the partition of India into Pakistan and India. And then there are certain climactic events that are covered and that somehow or the other Salim Sinai finds himself a part of. Now, the novel also becomes a novel of Pakistan because there is a part of the novel where Salim Sinai ends up in Pakistan. And he's there right at the time when the first dictator of Pakistan, General Ayub Khan, is planning his coup, right? So he's there during that time. And then he's also there and he's kind of lost his senses. He's forgotten who he is. But his sister had also immigrated to Pakistan. And then he's there during the 1971 war, which, of course, for Bangladesh was a war of independence. For Pakistanis, was a civil war. And then for India and Pakistan, it was a war because India intervened. And I think the most beautiful part of the novel is the part of the narrative, a few pages when our character, Salim Sinai, and a few of his colleagues are traveling through the Sundarbans, right? The mangrove forest in Bengal, right? And that, I think, is the most magical part of the novel. We learn about India's struggles, right? And the struggle of the Midnight's children maybe to take over the country and its promise, but that eventually fails against the implacable forces of the state. And Salim Sinai, as a narrator, slowly through his life experiences by the end of the novel. And if I could read a few passages, he is disintegrating. And we are not sure if we are supposed to read that as in India's future. Um, but here is the last paragraph. Yes, they will trample me underfoot, the numbers marching 1, 2, 3, 400 million, 506, reducing me to specks of voiceless dust, just as all in good time they will trample my son who is not my son, and his son who will not be his, and his who will not be his until the 1,001st generation, until 1,001 midnights have bestowed their terrible gifts, and 1,001 children have died, because it is the privilege and the curse of midnight's children to be both masters and victims of their times, to forsake privacy and be sucked into the annihilating whirlpool of the multitudes, and to be unable to live or die in peace. What does this remind you of? That's why I talked about postmodernism. I mean, other than the rich narrative richness of the passage, this is just how 100 years of solitude ends, on the same note. Nations that XXX do not deserve a second chance, right? It's the, if you look at the narrative style, even though this is in English and 100 Years of Solitude was in Spanish, the ending is pretty much the same, which points to even stylistic intertextuality of the novel. Okay, so these are some of the thoughts that I have about the novel. Now, of course, I could go into detail. One thing that comes really clear in this novel, but also in other novels of Salman Rushdie, that he is not very keen on the partition, right? And obviously, for whatever reasons, he doesn't like the idea of Pakistan, and we can talk about that as well. But what comes across here is India as this multitude of promise, right? Even though our characters, main character and all the other magical characters, are being crushed there as well, right, by the implacable political forces. But Pakistan, the way it is represented, it's a dark place, and that will come across when he writes Shame. And do keep in mind that Shame was written at a time when Pakistan was under its second military dictatorship. So, Rushdie has his own way of looking at this. I don't know. I've never really done a webinar on a novel before, and I don't feel like it would serve anyone any good if I just, went over the plot and characters. But I think what would be important to share is what would it take for someone, let's say from America or United Kingdom, or someone from not from India or Pakistan, to read this novel. And that's where the complexity of the novel comes into play, because what Salman Rushdie also but accentuates in metropolitan literary production is that he forces the Western reader, so-called Western reader, to acknowledge that there can be a whole repertoire of analogies and illusions, and not illusions, yes, illusions as well, but allusions. For that, a normal reader will not be prepared. An average graduate of my department at University of North Texas will have to be trained to understand who Scheherazade is, right? What is Hamza Nama? What is the mythology of Indian faith and religions, right? All of these things, what he does is he forces the metropolitan reader to acknowledge that there are civilizations beyond Europe. And if you really want to read a good story about them, you will have to familiarize yourself with their religious and historical mythologies. And I think that's a great service to post-colonial studies. Thank you. So thank you, all of you who have joined us. Let me see who I have not welcomed. Sania, welcome. And then Dinesh, welcome. and then Syed Saqib Ahmed and Hina Mir. Welcome back and Happy New Year. So I'm going to just briefly maybe find another theme in the novel. And one thing is the language in it. There is a term in post-colonial studies that we call metonomic gap, right? Metonomic gap is when a post-colonial author would put materials in the language, will use certain similes or metaphor or vocabulary that cannot really be understood if you only know English. That requires you to go and gain additional cultural knowledge to make sense of the sentences or a passage. And he does that a lot in here. Another thing that he does with the language in Midnight's Children, and pretty much all of his work, is that he would put terms from Hindi or Urdu in there which he doesn't gloss, right? And that also creates this complexity, another added layer of complexity to the language of the novel itself. Now, formalistically, the novel is pulling from the European novelistic tradition, but also from the Dastan tradition of India and the Middle East. But linguistically, he is mixing his language with, normal English, with how English is spoken by Indian middle classes, but how English vocabularies are employed by normal people. And sometimes it's a literal translation. Like there are moments where he will say, believe, not believe, right? Which people who know Hindi or Urdu would immediately understand, because even when we were kids, we will say in Urdu or Hindi that, believe, not believe, or kitab, vitab, right? All of these terms, he translates them here without giving us a key, which forces the metropolitan reader to go and learn more. Now, there is one big flaw in the novel. I don't know if any critics have picked it up, because there is also a very postmodern twist that he uses in the novel, which he, of course, borrows from Bollywood, is this idea that Salim Sinai was switched with another kid who was a servant's child. And he shows up later, right? His name is Shiva. And he's also one of the special children, right? So we go on reading this novel where Salim Sinai has inherited certain physical traits that are his father's, the nose and everything else, right? We read about it. And then we learn towards the middle of the novel that the children were switched, and Shiva is the actual son of Salim Sinai's father. And then you have to go back and figure out, okay, if the children were switched, how is it that Salim Sinai has certain biological resemblances with his father? Rushdie never really explains it. And a lot of us who read it, we just gloss over it. But to me, that's kind of a narrative flaw, a technical flaw in the novel. And I don't think so Rushdie resolves it. Okay, so it can be called a novel of India because most of it is set in India. But it's India during its colonial time. So you will see references to Jallianwala Bagh, you will see references to Congress, the Muslim League, the communal divide, then independence of India, which is inextricably connected to partition and creation of Pakistan. Then part of the story in India, part of the story in Pakistan, and then part of the story at the very moment when the 1971 conflict is being fought between Pakistan Army, the Bangladeshi independence movement, and the Indian intervention. All of these are deeply troubling and controversial pressure points of South Asia, right? Because people have different opinions on them. Partition, Indians and Pakistanis have completely different opinions on them. Then creation of Bangladesh, Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis have completely different opinions on them. So in one novel are then packed all these pressure points of South Asia. And they We are made privy to that through the experience of our narrator, Salim Sinai, who seems to have lived through all the major historical events of the region. So, in a way, then the novel is not just about India, right? It can be very easily called a South Asian novel. Now, what would it take for, let's say, someone who's not really familiar with Indian history is to at least know some basic aspects of colonialism in India? What kind of a system was developed by the British? What kind of political parties existed who fought for independence? Indian National Congress, you know, Indian Muslim League, then the creation of India and Pakistan, and the migration that happened and the massacres that happened. I mean, about 2 million people died in the transmigration immediately after India and Pakistan got their freedom. And then also the death and massacres in the 1971 civil war, which for Bangladeshis, of course, was a war of independence, and the controversial aspects of that. Then the role of Indira Gandhi and her family, the Nehru family in Indian politics. How does Indira Gandhi eventually become in the 1970s, mid 1970s, autocratic, right, and declares the only emergency in Indian history, right, in free Indian, post independence Indian history. And then the tragedy of more 1, 2, 3 dictatorships in Pakistan. So you can also read then through Salim Sinai's experiences, not just the colonial experience of these regions, but the post-colonial promise or failure as these nations grow and reach the 80s. And, you know, India is represented as this place of endless possibilities in Midnight's Children, right? It is diverse. It has thousands upon thousands of options. But the idea of India that he's representing towards the end of the novel is pretty bleak, right? And so he doesn't spare Indian politicians or Indian, but there is no doubt in the novel that Rushdie, of course, prefers the richness of the Indian culture, maybe at the risk of kind of flattening the Pakistani culture, but you know, Pakistani themselves are good at doing that, so they don't need Rushdie to do it. Cat Scratch Coder, how is this book received in Pakistan? I don't know. When I was in Pakistan, I read it and enjoyed it. I mean, I was one of the lucky people who read the Satanic Verses the year that it came out. It was banned, but a friend of mine had, what do you call it, smuggled it. So I read it when I was in the Pakistan Army. So I think people who enjoy complex novels and writings would like the novel. I don't think so anyone will teach it in Pakistan, but for political reasons, right? The kind of public culture that we are developing in Pakistan, sadly, is that people's lives can be imperiled if they teach Salman Rushdie or talk about him, which is sad. And I think it's not a great recipe for building a great nation. But then, I don't live in Pakistan, so reception would depend on who read it, how did they read it, what is their training. Most scholars that I know of, they of course love the book, but majority of people who have an opinion on Salman Rushdie's work in Pakistan actually have not read Salman Rushdie. So could you please explain further? It seems that there is an open debate about its Yeah, good. So, okay, magic realism, especially the kind that Garcia Marquez and other boom writers from Latin America do, one important distinction that we are taught to make is that it is magic realism if magic is represented as part of everyday life. If magical aspects of the story point to themselves as being magical, then it's fantasy, then it's not magic realism. That's why we add realism to it. So if you read Garcia Marquez, right, any instance of magic that is represented there, it's represented within the logic of the story, that it happens. Oh, so and so is flying and so has come back from the dead. There is no announcing that, oh, this is something strange happening. Now, how did Garcia Marquez come up with it? Is because in one of his interviews, when he was asked about his technique, he basically said that when he was trying to come up with a writerly voice, he remembered how his grandmother used to tell her stories. And when she told her stories, there was no reference to, oh, and then something magical happened. She will just state it as it is. So that's one of the distinctions to make if you're going to declare something magic realism, is that the magical part of the story has to be represented as if it's an everyday happening, and that it's not something special and magical. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But because then it borders into fantasy. And in the fantasy, we already know, because a whole fantastical world is created and it has its own logic, and we believe in it, but at all times we believe in it because it exists in that fantastical world. Magic realism, you are in the real world and magical things are happening, but they are not necessarily represented as magical things. They are magical, but they are part of the logic of the world in which you live. So that's the distinction to make. Okay. Yeah, so yes, Infinita, you see, it's a different technique in 100 Years of Solitude and here. I have a question, Jahangir, regarding the novel. Don't you believe Midnight's Children uses magical realism as a tool to rewrite the partition of India from an anti-communal and anti-nationalist perspective? Well, I mean, the first point is already debatable whether it is magic realism or not. I I practically do not care which point of view does it uses. Almost all major novels of India see the creation of Pakistan not as a natural outcome, but as an outcome of communal politics. Okay, heightening of communal politics, built on the idea that Muslims and Hindus' differences were irreconcilable, but they could not live together, which an idea that was defied by history itself, which was totally constructed out of thin air, right? Because Muslims and Hindus had lived together for centuries and are still living together with some political tensions, but those tensions happen not naturally, but because they are politicized. So if the novel is trying to think the partition of India in terms of communal politics, yeah, maybe it is. To me, if you read Aisha Jalal, it's pretty obvious that communalism was a part of the politics of the division of India and Pakistan. So yeah, it's trying to retrieve an idea of India which is beyond communalism, but it fails eventually because the politics disrupts that whole idea. Now, if you're going to novels of India, if you read River of Fire, Aag Ka Darya, it has the same thing, okay? That these people live together with their differences, of course, but it is after the partition is when they start seeing each other as the other. And that is inscribed in that Indian and Pakistani politics of seeing the other as the other, right? Because objective differences are mobilized to a certain politics. If you look at India and Pakistan right now and Bangladesh, the two nations of India and Pakistan have so much historically in common that if they could dare to imagine, if their leaders, the politicians and intellectuals could dare to imagine, right, they could very easily sit together and say, hey guys, like let's open this border up and let's create a confederacy of autonomous regions, but with a central government. That is exactly what Mr. Jinnah had wanted. Pakistan. But yeah, you can very easily read it as a critique of communalism, as a critique of failure of India's promise. And that I read the novel as that as well. But the thing about a novel of this scale is that there is no way you can actually do any extensive work in an essay or an article. So you have to pick up one chunk of it and write about that, or read about that. When I teach, once or twice when I've taught Mudnight's children, I've taught it over about 6 weeks in a semester, because we wanted to go over it carefully. And even then I realized I had not done a good job. No, I haven't. English literature. Okay, no, I haven't read Uzma Aslam Khan's latest novel, but I do like her. I like her work. I really respect her work. There are cats. Yes, a film has been made on Mudnight's Children. I didn't really enjoy it much. Maybe because I was expecting more, but it is a production of, I don't know, Bollywood or someone in England. All I know is Homi Baba's son is the main character in there. And I think you can purchase it on iTunes or somewhere. I have it, but to be very honest, when I read it, there is no way a film can kind of convey the richness of the novel. But it is, because Rushdie himself was involved in the production, it is a pretty good rendition of the novel. And it is entitled The Mudnight's Children. So you can look it up. Sir, can we say magical realism is expression of repression? I don't know what that question means. I mean, first of all, you will have to define what repression is. Okay. And its expression can be in any form. It can be in realistic form. It can be in the form of sublimation. You're repressing something, you go and do something that is permissible. It can be that the repression and magic realism, I don't see like a direct correlation, right? Can someone express their repressed memories through delusions? Yes, absolutely. But magic realism is a form of writing. I don't think that it is a natural outcome of repression. It can be a natural outcome of a hedonistic way of life as well, right? That someone enjoys a certain fantastical way of living, and then he or she goes and creates that. There are many perspectives on partition. Now we have to accept it as a fact and treat each other as independent neighbors and talk. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think both sides now, with Modi and Pakistanis, there is a tendency to create this other, this menacing other, because it makes politics easy. It makes keeping people in check easy, right? And it becomes a really great justification of whatever you want to do as people in power. But I absolutely agree that they should take the partition as a historical fact and then turn around and say, okay, our ancestors lived together, right? We used to have villages in which there used to be a temple, a mosque, a gurdwara. Can we sit and talk and have peace? That would, and if they did that, if they had the courage to do that, look at the history that they can rely on of having lived together, shared languages, shared stories. So absolutely, I agree with that. But here is the thing. I get this question a lot. People would ask me, here is the essay I have an exam on. Here is the book. Can you help? You don't need help with that from anyone. No one should expect you to reproduce answers in a literature exam that are perfect. Okay, so what I do on this channel through these live talks, but also through recorded videos, is to introduce you to tools. If someone tells you, go and give me your 2-page opinion on this short story, you don't need Masood Raja to tell you what that story means. You take the concepts that you've learned and you read the story with that, and your own opinion is valid as long as you can prove it that within the context of the story, what you are saying can mean what you are saying it means. Now, the problem is, I don't think so. It's not with you. It's with the educational systems that we have, somewhat in India, but mostly also in Pakistan, where people in humanities expect us to have precise answers or one answer to a question. And no one can help you with that except for the teacher who's asking you to answer the questions. Because if he or she is not willing to entertain a different answer, supported by your reading of the story, then you have to point blank ask them, give me an essay in which you have answered that question so that I can memorize it and reproduce it. So keep that in mind, that in humanities, there are no single correct answers. They are all provisional, and they are all dependent on where we come from, what our politics is, what our preferred modes of reading are, and what are we reading in a story, and then reproduce it. As long as you can convince your audience that your argument makes sense, that's a good enough answer. Okay. Okay, Mary. Yes, please do read the novel. You will enjoy it. Amit, sir, please say something about Ngugi wa Thiong'o. So, Amit, I have a few lectures on Ngugi, right? Especially one on Devil on the Cross, but also on his scholarly writing. You can watch those, but that gives me a good idea. Maybe in the future we can do like one whole discussion on Devil on the Cross. Now, do keep in mind that Ngugi Thiong'o isn't just a writer. He's also an activist. He's also a scholar. So when you talk about him and read his works, it's also important to read Decolonizing the Mind, right? Which is his book, which deals with issues of colonial education and language and what role does language play on it. Now, on my channel, I think I have one recorded lecture on his handling of the question of language. And then, of course, I have one introductory conversation on the Devil on the Cross, which should really help you with Ngugi Thiong'o. But are there not any Muslims in of course, yeah. I mean, Muslims are the largest minority in India. And actually, Muslims in India are actually the largest population of Muslims living in a nation state, right? Maybe other than Indonesia. So pretty much all parts of India have Muslims living with other religions. In some areas, they are a very large minority or even a majority in Kashmir. Uh, but pretty much they live in the south, they live in the north. So, and they've lived there for centuries. The Indian Muslims who live in the India's south, they didn't even come from the north. They came from the different trade routes. So yes, it is a mixed population. I would say there is not even a single Indian state that doesn't have Muslims living in it. India is religion, in terms of religion, one of the most diverse nations on the planet. Okay, so Fayaz, sir, can partition literature be studied at anything can be studied as part of the revisionist history. Now, the point is, do you take revisionist as a derogatory term, or do you take it as something that allows us to imagine history differently? Now, if you're talking about historiography in Pakistan, especially in Pakistan studies, you bring me any books on Pakistan studies from Pakistan, and I can promise you that. And I will, in 30 minutes, tell you how much of it is hagiography and fiction and how much of it is actual history. In my opinion, what I've read of historical works on Pakistan, in Pakistan on partition, other than Aisha Jalal's work and a few other scholars like Tariq Ali and others, all others are doing hagiography. No one tells you the actual background, the actual story. So it comes across as revisionist history because a lot of time people in Pakistan are not familiar with what was actually happening. And no one teaches us that. I went through the Pakistani educational system. All my life I memorized 14 points of Qaid-e-Azam, right? Or, the 1956 Constitution. No one actually taught me why did it take us until 1956 to make a constitution. So revisionist history then depends on what is it that you're calling revisionist? Is it a history that challenges the normative drive of a national history? And so in that sense, it is revisionist because it's saying, here are the things that you're missing. Then that's a good thing. Revisionist history can also be mobilized to underwrite the most terrible things in the world, right? By creating an alternative world in which a certain group or a constituency is demonized and made responsible for certain things that happen to the majority community. And so that kind of revisionist writing can become deeply destructive, right? So you will have to first define what do you mean by revisionist history, what's your opinion on it, and then that will give you the idea of whether or not these novels can be considered that or not. One aspect of the linguistic educations, and it comes across clearly if you read Ngugi's Colonizing the Mind, is how human subjectivities are created through colonial languages. I've talked about it previously as well, but part of it is as you're learning English or French as a language of communication, what you're also internalizing as a child is the superiority of that language and hence the superiority of that culture. So the trauma of colonial education then isn't just that you lose your own language, but that you have also internalized this implicitly, this idea that somehow the Europeans are superior. So the project of undoing it is huge because you first have to retrieve your own languages and culture, teach them that, and then teach them not to hate English or French, but maybe to teach them that there is something worthy of loving and respecting in their own culture as well. Going to Jahangir, the novel begins with Dr. Aziz's experience, Kashmir. It recalls us, Dr. Aziz in Forrester's A Passage to India, which ends with Aziz settling in Kashmir. It's absolutely significant. As I said, the novel Midnight's Children is highly intertextual. So it's significant in two senses. Is one, that it's drawing on a previously established novel, A Passage to India. But two, it's also kind of drawing on Rushdie's own preference of Kashmir as one of the regions that he really loves, but also Kashmir and its significance for the Nehru family, for the Pandits, right? And so all of that, I think, is intertwined in setting the novel in Kashmir. And if you read the passages in Kashmir, the way Rushdie describes the Dal Lake, and that's one of the only parts of the novel which is deeply poetic, right? And is beautiful because we know, as Rushdie describes the valley, it's written out of a lot of love. So absolutely, you can make that connection. So what is neocolonization? So I have a video on it already. You should watch it out. If you know what colonization is, you can very easily define neocolonization yourself. Colonization is when one dominant group actually goes and captures the spaces and culture of another minority group and then tries to dictate their life through hegemony or dominance according to their own group. So if you have that definition in mind, then there can be internal colonizations, there can be external colonizations. I have a video on neo-imperialism because my idea is that the former colonial powers and powerful nations in the world do not need to go and actually colonize the global spaces. So there's a new form of imperialism where the economic policies and sometimes the political policies are remotely controlled by powers that be. And that is a form of neo-colonialism, but in its imperialistic form, because there is no physical occupation. Every parts of India have Muslim community, and it is diverse in nature because of the diverse nature of India. Absolutely, yeah, I agree with that. I have no qualms in telling anyone, my own students here or any other scholars in the world, that to me, despite all its problems, and we all know India has its problems, the problem in Kashmir, right? Dealing with Kashmiris, the problems of Adivasis, the problems of the Dalit population. With all those problems, India is the most diverse democracy in the world, the most promising democracy in the world. Think of it this way. I mean, here is a nation of 1 billion people. They have been able to sustain a democratic system for 72 years, right? They have had uninterrupted transition of power from one elected government to another for 72 years. How many post-colonial nations have accomplished that? They've had one constitution since 1950s, written by B.R. Ambedkar. They have had amendments in it. So that's not denying the fact that India has deep problems which are in the novel as well. And that, but maintaining that kind of a democratic system for a complex culture is an accomplishment, and we need to acknowledge that, right? And I absolutely agree with that. What about Pakistan? I'm from Pakistan, right? No Pakistani can ever tell me that I'm not from Pakistan, because the village where my family still lives, we have lived there for more than 1,000 years. So all these Pervez Musharraf and these generals and others, I don't really care whether they consider me Pakistani or not. But Pakistan's history is tragic. I mean, tragic in a sense that it's a country that has a lot of promise. It has a lot of young, brilliant people, right? A lot of hardworking people who eke out their living despite what is going on. A lot of decent, caring people, right? But it has not been able to cobble together a viable political system. And that is a fact. And the reason they haven't been able to, because there have been interruptions. We have had 3 martial laws under one pretext or another. So what happens in a nation is when non-democratic forces take over power, they don't just take over power, they corrupt the system, because people no longer can develop a way of thinking of themselves as citizens of a democracy, right? And develop the responsibilities and privileges of that. So that's a huge tragedy in Pakistan. But as long as the people go, and especially the young people, I think, they're as good or as bad as young people anywhere in the world. I'm still hopeful about Pakistan, but I think their intellectuals will need more freedom to express themselves. I mean, right now, the reality in Pakistan is that there are institutions you cannot talk about. You can't touch religion, right? Because they will threaten you. You can't touch the military and other institutions critically because they threaten you. So the intellectuals and the young people who want to write, they have this really limited space, unless they want to imperil their lives, right? And that's a terrible thing for any public sphere to have. And that is the tragedy of Pakistan, because if their intellectuals are not free to write and talk about any issue that is important to them, and if they're not producing knowledge in them, then that is harming the general public sphere and how people think about things. But overall, I will never stop loving Pakistan, because, that's where I came from. Yes, I mean, you can see it not only in India. I mean, I live in United States. You see how fragile democratic systems are. Our national capital got invaded last week. That is the beauty and the ultimate fragility of democracy, that it relies on consensus, right? And it is not a dictatorial system, and that all democratic systems are fragile, and need constant practice of sustaining them and need constant thinking about sustaining them. Because if you take your eyes off, some demagogue from here or there is going to mobilize people to undo the project of democracy. So democracy as a system is the most promising system anywhere in the world, but also the most fragile because it requires the active, learned, critical participation of the people. How to engage with everyday decolonial, how to make sense of academy that cites decolonial. Well, I am very skeptical of how decolonialism is being mobilized by some of my Pakistani friends. I don't believe in binaries. And Spivak and Baba and Saeed would agree with you. This idea of East, West, and North and South. Yeah, when I'm criticizing literally how power works, I will criticize America and Canada, but I don't work through pure decolonial knowledge. There is nothing such as that. If you are going to retrieve your own cosmologies and things, the best use of them is not to create an independent sphere where you say, here is our decolonized knowledge and we're not going to bring anything from outside. That will create the most destructive knowledge available because it is not in the present interacting with the knowledge elsewhere in the world. So I have a problem with how decolonialism is being retrieved in India, in Pakistan. In India, I have a couple of people who are Dharma scholars. And so their idea is that if we jettison the Western influence and retrieve the pure concept of dharma and how it is practiced, we'll make a great world. No, you won't make a great world because it will bring along with it its own inequalities, its own oppressions, because they are inscribed in it. And they are inscribed in it, and then people will read it and interpret it, and you will create a world which will then go out to say, we are a Hindu majority country, we should be a Hindu nation. Similarly, scholars in Pakistan are basically saying if we Islamize our thought, we have been Islamizing our thought for 70 years, we haven't accomplished much so far. But the idea is, no, has to be Islamized. Let's go retrieve some Ghazali, let's go retrieve some Al-Kindi, all the other scholars and jettison, Kant and Hegel and all, and maybe we'll come up. No. I mean, the best Islamic scholars were great scholars because they were aware of both the tradition. Dr. Fazlur Rahman, even Iqbal to some extent, Sayyid Qutb even. So to me, how to engage with decolonization, I would say, is never be hesitant to borrow knowledge from anyone, for as long as it enables you to create a more humane, equal, and compassionate world. Now, if you want to infuse it with your own philosophy, with your own religion, there is nothing wrong with it. If it liberates more people, so I become slightly consequential or utilitarian when it comes to the world. If it enables more people, if it makes the world a tolerant place, yeah, that is, to me, the right form of decolonial knowledge. Rushdie's satanic verses is considered by many Muslims. What's your view, sir? I'm not going to give you my view on a public forum like that. But my views on the satanic verses are published in 3 articles that are already available. You can read them. And my views on the satanic verses are available, will be available in my forthcoming book, which actually starts with the Rushdie affair. But I will... for as long as I want to go back to Pakistan and visit my family and not feel threatened by the people, I am very hesitant to give an opinion in a flippant manner on a book of that complexity. Why do the writer from the ex-colonies produce literature in the colonizer's language rather than in any indigenous legacy? That's a really good question. And this is a question that Chinwe Zhu asks, right? In decolonizing the African mind. And actually, Ngugi Thiong'o also asks the same question in decolonizing the mind in his book. And in African studies, there are two huge, what do you call it, segments of African literary production. There was one group led by Chinua Achebe and others who believed that the colonial languages are a gift that the colonizers left us, and there should be nothing wrong in producing knowledge in them and writing in them. And then there is a group of people like Chinwezu and Ngugi Thiago who say that no, there is a need of producing literature in our native languages so that people can connect to it better. These are the two schools of thought in Africa. I think it doesn't really matter which language you use to write, but it should not be at the cost of the native languages. English should not replace, let's say, Brahmi or Balochi or Tamil or, any other native languages. The English should not supplant it. So there can be parallel traditions, and they should be respected and they should be protected, right? Other than that, be my guest. If you want to go write in Greek, do that. A text is not just the language that carries it. It also has the politics behind it. Karl Marx wrote Capital in German. We read it in English, right? It doesn't become less revolutionary when we read it in English, right? So, okay, Said is also very much critical on binarism. Absolutely. And even if you read his entire oeuvre, Said was a product of the Western educational system, and he's a great example of how to construct a critical self. A critical self that's aware of the deep discussions of the metropolitan culture, right? And all its lineage, philosophical and other, and then it infuses it with the knowledge of its own culture. I just recently recorded a supplement to Said's discussion of worldliness, right? That's a great example of a scholar who knows exactly where the debate is in the metropolitan culture on how to read a text, right? But where is he going to get his sources, right? He's going to the 11th century Spain, right? To Al-Andalus, to take people like Ibn Hazm and three other Muslim grammarians from there and their views on language, on Zahiriya and Batiniya. And then he weaves that into his debate of the value of a literary text. And that is brilliant because that allows him to argue for a different mode of reading at a higher level of abstraction, but also retrieving resources that were otherwise forgotten, even by the Arabs themselves, right? And I think that's the brilliant kind of scholarship that I would encourage in my students, instead of just relying on I am Hindu and I'm Muslim and I'm Pakistani and I'm Indian. Those are very small, easy signifiers to place ourselves in. Maybe life becomes easier, but I'm sure it's not richer, right? Richer in intellectual and spiritual sense. Okay, so we've been going on for quite some time now. As I always, we start with a given topic and then we go elsewhere. But overall, if you have not read Midnight's Children, right, and you want to read an exemplary novel, a novel that tells the story of one of the most complex post-colonial nation states, but also regions, but does that with humor, by parodying history and historical characters, by juxtaposing real life historical events with fictionalized historical events, through the voice of a very interesting first person narrator, and a novel that is enriched by the novelistic tradition of the West, but also storytelling tradition of India and the East, I think this would be a great novel. Now, you can't just pick it up and read it on a flight. You have to, it's a postmodern, late modernist text. And one attribute of any modernist text is that it tells you, I'm a work of art. if you want to read me, you will have to read me carefully, page by page, and then I will render my secret to you. Some post-colonial writings are cynical anthropologies. I don't know if I can answer this question because you'll have to give me a specific text to work with here. I mean, think of it this way. I mean, where do scholars come from, right? Scholars live in the world. They have a politics. They have their preferences. Sometimes micro, where are they working? Are they working towards promotion? Are they working towards self-aggrandizement? All of these things play a role in what they produce. Some scholars are connected to the public sphere. They are connected to the world. They think of the world and say, maybe I can help change it, right? Then their writing would be different. Some scholars are connected to national politics. They are nationalistics. They are American. I can bring you works of American scholars who believe in the myth of American nationalism, and their writing would be completely different from Noam Chomsky. So depending on the situatedness of the scholar, then you have to distinguish whether they are in that purely Gramscian sense, if they are foundational scholars or organic intellectuals. If they are foundational scholars, they are speaking for an institution, for a government, for a nation. So that means their politics is aligned with that. If they are organic intellectuals, maybe their politics is aligned with the people, with a constituency that is struggling. All of this bears upon whether your work is cynically anthropological, whether you're trying to sell the tropes of your own culture to an international audience. All of that is inscribed within that practice. And you have to distinguish who is coming from where and what are you imputing on them, or whether you're fair in doing that. That is where your critical repertoire comes in, right? Jahangir Khan, is it true that Midnight's Children, Rushdie ignores or silences the role the British played in creating circumstances? No, he doesn't silence it. There's a pretty strong indictment of the British abdication of responsibility. Absolutely. I am a student of English literature, but I have boycotted blasphemers. It is a name that always be kept as a, okay, you feel free. I mean, absolutely. I teach in America, so, I have my own way of looking at things. You can absolutely choose to do whatever you feel like doing. So Infinita, yes, I have read all of his short stories, East, West, and I read them quite a while ago, but I think I'm teaching one this coming semester, and that is The Quarter from East, West. And but yes, I am aware of his short stories, and also I've read all of his essays too. I mean, I did my master's thesis on Salman Rushdie. So absolutely, I've read those. Okay, Larry. Thank you. Oh, thank you. So I will post more of my Bengal cat videos. So great. So if you're working on them in your thesis, yeah, please feel free to message me and we can talk some more about it. Yeah, absolutely. Nadia, can you say something about the transnational perspective in Rushdie's works? Yes, of course. I mean, if you look at all of Rushdie's repertoire, most of his early novels, the three early novels, I mean, I'm not counting Grimace, but if you look at Midnight's Children, Shame, and the Satanic Verses, in the first two, he stays in the subcontinent. In the second one, he's in London, right? And also in the period of the early rise of Islam. Then you go to his later novels, they deal with, one is about Hollywood, one is about Bollywood, then we are in Spain. So pretty much in one, we are of course, in quite a few, we are in America. So in so many ways, the things that he has written about are already transnational in terms of the setting. But also then the views that he expresses in so many of his works are also transnational, because you can't pinpoint it as British only or Indian only or Pakistani only, because in so many ways there is a wonderful book by Timothy Brennan. It was an early book by him on Salman Rushdie, which was called Cosmopolitanism and the Third World Novel, in which he was trying to say why is it that cosmopolitanists, of which he considers Rushdie one of them, have a problem in getting a lot of traction in literary production because they lack a habitus, right? Whereas people who write in nationalistic traditions, their work is received differently, but do also keep in mind that Timothy Brennan is one of the very few defenders of the nation state in opposition to forces of globalization. I mean, of course, his reasons are very complex and not chauvinistic and all, but that's the perspective from where that book comes from. But I think it's called Salman Rushdie and the Third World Novel. That's the book. And so pretty much it goes without saying that everyone acknowledges Rushdie as a transnational novel in terms of his own subjectivity as an author, but also in terms of what he writes and the issues that he deals with. Okay. Thank you so much. And so I think, Nadia, I answered your question. So here is the thing, and I'm going to leave you on this. When you do literary studies, it will depend on where you are. Okay. One aspect of any humanistic education is that you don't restrain your thought, because the decisions that you make about any text or how you receive it and how you write about it should be informed decisions. We are scholars, right? We are writers, we are teachers. Anyone who thinks that words of one or two authors can technically destroy our mind and our morality is already imagining that we have such weak structures of subjectivity that they can be corrupted by a book. Yeah, for children, maybe we need to give them a more guided education. But after you've become scholars and you're intellectually sound, you'll form your own opinions. You will, whatever I've published about Salman Rushdie, I've never published like a work which says, "Oh, I love Salman Rushdie." It's highly critical of Salman Rushdie, the way he represents women, the way he represents even Islam. I've been highly critical of it, but I've been highly critical of it from an informed perspective, because so that you create a body of work that says, my forthcoming book, right, Democratic Criticism, Poetics of Incitement and the Muslim Sacred, basically tries to answer one question, and that is the silence in the West to explain the anguish felt by Muslim readers, right? And why is it that that anguish and its non-violent expression was derided and laughed at? That is the question that that book is trying to answer. In order to write that book, I have to read Salman Rushdie. I have to read everything that he has written. I cannot write that book simply by saying that I blocked Salman Rushdie, right? So that is what is at stake. If you want to develop a voice, if you want to speak for a constituency that has been silenced, you have to go and learn the vocabularies of abstraction at which you will mount that challenge. You cannot do that by simply excluding knowledge that might not be familiar to you or might be unsettling. So that's the kind of work I encourage my students to do. So the Fayaz, the role of translations, by and large, I think it is a very enabling role. Think of it, I would have not been familiar with 100 Years of Solitude without a translation. I would have not been able to teach in my English classes River of Fire had it not been available in translation. I would have not been able to teach The Adventures of Amir Hamza if Musharraf Ali Faruqi had not translated it. So now I am aware as a scholar of the limitations of a translation, because a translation cannot carry what Amy Abster calls the untranslatable, right? And that we already know. But I think if we take a translation and read it and teach it, and we enter it with the humility to acknowledge that it cannot replace the original, right? I think we will still be better off if in comparison to if we didn't have a translation. So that's somehow my idea about translation. Gonna leave you here. We've been going for quite some time now. And this will also be available later, but the idea is Rushdie or any other author that you read. Uh, I have never entered any book, sacred or profane, with this idea that it will give me all the answers, because no book does. All you do is you bring yourself to it, and part of what you're reading is yourself, right? But what I do believe is that if we really want to do something in the world, make a difference, we have to connect our work to the public, and we have to connect our work to the silenced constituencies, to speak in solidarity with them, not for them ever, but with them, right? And to develop more and more lateral solidarities through our work, through our teaching. And that's what I focus on. So I hope this was useful to you. I'm going to conclude here, and thank you so much for joining me. And please do also keep in mind that we have a Facebook page. You can join us there. We also now have a podcast, which is called Postcolonial Space. You can join us on the podcast as well. The links will be in the description. And as always, I will announce the topic for the next week, probably, in the beginning of next week. And if all goes well, I will see you next Saturday. So thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful Saturday. Okay, bye-bye, and as always, peace and love.